Hello and welcome back to our Catechism review. We're going to do the seventh commandment today, which is on pages 105 through 109 of this edition of the Catechism that you have. And we're going to kind of talk through it a little bit more closely than we have been. But first, I want to cover the issue of the difference between these commandments and the laws. There are ways to break the commandments that are perfectly legal. There are ways to keep the commandments that might be illegal. There's not necessarily perfect correlation between the Ten Commandments as we understand them in the church and what the United States or the state of Indiana or Illinois or whatever has as the law. So when we talk about the law, we're talking about God's law, the moral law that's written on our hearts, and sometimes our laws line up with that and sometimes not. And with all of the commandments, there are ways to break the commandment without getting in trouble with the police or the law because they're dealing with separate things. The seventh commandment and the memory work is in the box as usual. We should fear and love God so that we do not take our neighbor's money or possessions or get them in any dishonest way, but help him to improve and protect his possessions and income. Remember that this is just a gloss or a review of love your neighbor as yourself. Talked about his life, talked about body and family, and now we're talking about your neighbor's stuff. Your neighbor's stuff should matter as much to you as your own stuff. You see people breaking this commandment all the time when they do something as simple as treat something that's rented less carefully than they would treat it if they owned it. Because the idea is, well, this isn't mine, so it doesn't matter if it gets taken care of. Well, that's not loving your neighbor as yourself in regards to your neighbor's possessions. So as we look through this, why are earthly goods and such as money and possessions important? Question 78. They're good gifts of God. There's nothing wrong with having possessions. When we do the first article of the Creed, you're going to see that God gives people all kinds of things. But he gives them to your neighbor as well. And the idea is that we rejoice in gratitude for the things that God gives us, but that we not be focused strictly on our own, but that we be focused on everyone's. So how do we fear and love God by keeping this commandment? Well, obviously you don't steal. I think everybody knows what stealing is in the most basic sense. You don't take things that don't belong to you. But look at B in the middle of the page on 106. Being lazy or sloppy when working as employees. When you are getting paid to do a job, you are exchanging goods and services. If you're being paid and you aren't doing a good job, that's really stealing. It's the same as if your employer refused to pay you after you did a good job. You're exchanging money for services. You do the services as though you are doing them. In the Bible, it really says as though you are doing them for God. You do your very best when you're working for somebody and you expect to get a fair wage for that. So if you're being lazy or sloppy as an employee, you're breaking the seventh commandment. C, acquiring goods by dishonesty, fraud, or taking advantage of others. Taking advantage of others is the big one. I always tell the story in class of when my little brother and I were small. We used to fly kites all the time, and so we had all this kite string that we would wind around a piece of kindling wood, hundreds and hundreds of feet of it, and a lot of it was old and not that great anymore. Little neighbor boy across the street who was younger than we were got $5 for his birthday, and he just kind of wanted to be cool with the big kids. So he wanted whatever we thought was cool. We were playing with all this kite string, and he offered my brother $5 for this roll of kite string that couldn't have been worth more than about 75 cents. And we said, sure, great. Well, my mom made us go over to their house and give back the $5 for the kite string because we were taking advantage of him. We weren't looking out for him as our neighbor the way we were looking out for ourselves. We knew he was a little kid. He had no idea what he was talking about. He just wanted to be in on it. with what we were doing and took advantage of that. That's stealing because it's saying it's more important that I have the most that I can possibly get than it is that this other little kid have the most that he could possibly get. So whenever you're engaging in a transaction, you make sure that both sides are getting a good deal. Otherwise, you're taking advantage of somebody. Maybe they're not as smart as you are. Maybe they don't know as much as you do about what they're buying or selling, but you don't take advantage of people's weaknesses. Otherwise, what you're doing is saying, I matter more than that person. Um, and then if we talk about what else is considered our neighbor's possessions or property, um, that's question 80 on page 107. Um, that can include a lot of different things. It's not just physical stuff. It's talking about intellectual property, so respecting copyrights. For instance, at church, there's a lot of songs that we can do and put online for our services, but there are also a lot of songs that we can't do without paying a fee because some songwriter, that's how he makes his living, he or she, and when you put on performance of those, you have to pay. So you have to honor copyright laws. Uh, uh, it can be, downloading things, movies. This happens a lot with the invention of the internet. Ways of stealing have become very, very different than they were when I was little, but you still have to respect people's property. How does God provide us and others with our earthly goods? This is question 81. Well, he makes the earth bountiful. He makes things grow. You wouldn't know it today looking outside when it's snowing in the middle of April, but flowers are coming up. When crops are planted, they grow. He makes the earth fruitful and he puts valuable things, metals and other things. He makes, he provides for people. The vocation of parents, family, and neighbors. One of your jobs as a parent is to provide for your children. So if you are a small child, you still get to eat and you still have clothes, but somebody else provides that for you, and that's God providing it for you through your parents. Also through our jobs and careers. That's another type of vocation where you're called to serve your neighbor with your job or your career, and you get a fair wage for a fair job that you do. So whatever it is that you do to make a paycheck, that is God providing you with those things through that employer. And if you are an employee, and we're going to talk about this at the end of the catechism when we're doing vocations, if you're an employee, you make sure that your employer is getting what he pays for. And if you are an employer, you make sure that your employees are taken care of. That's by God's design. And we'll talk about that more. How should we use our earthly goods? Question 82. You make sure that the people for whom you are responsible are provided for. So when I get a check, I have to make sure that there's enough groceries for my family, or that the house has a place for everybody in my family. You also use it to benefit others, including the poor. So you might give to church, and then the church has a food bank, or you might do other things that help the poor. And then lastly, you make sure that the church has the resources it needs. So, everybody has to have a catechism. Well, you buy one at the beginning of the year. If somebody can't afford a catechism, somebody else in church provides it for them. The hymnals in the pews, the building that you go to when you're allowed to go out of your house, at least in normal years, all of that is provided for anybody who wants to use it, but people have to pitch in and make that happen. And then the last thing is, all of creation prospers when we focus on doing this correctly. So the law shows you your sin because you know in your heart of hearts that you treat your own things as more important than you treat other people's things. You take advantage when you can, or at least you're inclined to. And that's a problem with the sinfulness of our hearts. And so the seventh commandment shows you your sin when it holds you up to the mirror and says, you're not really loving your neighbor as yourself because your stuff matters a lot more to you than your neighbor's stuff. But when we seek to do God's will, when we want to keep this commandment, that's how we look at it. We simply want to make sure that everybody is grateful for what they have and has opportunities to preserve and protect his property and income, and we help not only ourselves, but others. And tomorrow we'll go in, or actually Monday, we'll go into the eighth commandment, but please continue on and especially be reciting, excuse me, reciting that memory work several times today. It's very important, and we'll talk to you soon.